Well, joining me now are two men who've spent a long time in the business of politics and communications, and those worlds where trust is perhaps the most important currency. James Moore is a public policy advisor at Edelman Canada and former Canadian cabinet minister, and Joe Lockhart is a former press secretary and advisor to President Bill Clinton and a vice chairman at Edelman in the United States. Good to see you both. Thanks for being here. So you had your conference in Ottawa today that talked about trust and the Edelman Trust Barometer. And I want to drill down, if I can, on some of the things you've found and sort of where Canadians and others are at on this whole issue of trust. Should we be concerned, or should we be comforted by where we are in the issue of trust, not just in Canada, but in democracies around the world? Joe, let me start with you.
Yeah, I think the answer is both. I think the rise of the internet, social media have given an enormous number of new tools to voters. It has, in many places, the U.S., Canada, and beyond, really started to change the elite structure of politics. But the concern is, I think, if you look around the world, the public isn't fully equipped yet to decipher that information, to separate the wheat from the chaff, and there's a lot of room for mischief.
How do you mean that? How do we get fully equipped?
How we get fully equipped by becoming more educated consumers. You know, we have a lot of people who are sophisticated consumers when they use the internet to buy a product, but when it comes to politics, they have trouble deciphering, you know, between a bot and a real person. You know, the problem is probably most extreme right now in the U.S. because you have outside forces trying to manipulate. But the problem is common in all democracies because, you know, as long as your vote counts, people are going to do whatever they can to get it, including using disinformation.
What do you think is happening in this country, James Moore?
Well, taking a step back actually to the global, which will have a Canadian impact in terms of its perception, you know, we forget that not that long ago, during the Green Revolution in Iran, the Orange Revolution as well, the people were actually talking about nominating Twitter and its founders for a Nobel Peace Prize because it was a tool for democratization, liberalization,
opened up conversation, opened up connections.
So the spectrum of where digital and social media have gone in terms of its impact on democracy have gone from the really, really good in terms of giving people in totalitarian regimes an ability to broadcast out to the world some of the horrific things that were happening on the ground, to even in the United States, like let's not forget that in Ferguson and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States was also fueled by videos that were put on social media that sort of illuminated sort of the militarization of police forces and all that, all the way through until now the pendulum has swung the other direction. So you've seen the really good, sort of the really explosive consequences, and now really negative consequences. And so now you see the current government talking about looking at some kind of regulation of social media and what it means and all that. But the reality is it's still the Wild West. And these are very dangerous tools and very powerful tools for good and for bad. So that's the macro. Right. And I think on an individual basis for individual Canadians, you know, you can absolutely, as the cliche goes, create your own echo chamber of just reinforcing your own values, reinforcing your own views, and sourcing in and creating like an iTunes playlist of people who are more articulate outwardly than you are with your own internal dialogue, and really get your views just weaponized in a way that can be really aggressive, isolating, and desocializing.
So that's a social media piece, and that's part of the conversation. And Joe, I know you have some history there, as you were with Facebook at one point. The big conversation in this country now is whether we need to regulate social media platforms. We need to, you know, really, if as James points out, it's going to be this kind of Wild West where the rules are hazy at best. What do you think of that? What do you think of the conversation that says if they're not going to protect elections, for instance, in Canada from foreign interference and misinformation and disinformation, do we need to force them to do it?
Yeah, I think that it's a combination of two things. A combination of transparency. I think all of the social media companies need to be more transparent about where things are coming from and who's paying for it. And some of them are trying, some of them are ignoring. But I think even Mark Zuckerberg said last month that it's too much for the CEO of one company now to grapple with this. He's trying to deal with it all over the world, in Canada and the U.S., you know, in Asia, in Europe. And he's now inviting the government to sit down and governments around to sit down and come up with some sensible regulations. You have to have both, though, because the innovation within this industry, within tech, moves so quickly, and government regulation moves so slowly that you have to, they'll never completely keep up. So transparency, people knowing what they're seeing is a big piece of it.
Let's drill down on a couple of more key parts of the trust barometer. And James, let me turn to you with. I found it really interesting when you look at the survey measures two kinds of Canadians, and I'm not sure whether the survey measured the same around the world, but
yeah.
Whether informed Canadians who are educated versus the mass populations, and there's this growing gap between the two, and it's a 20% gap in Canada. I think probably the largest gap or second largest gap anywhere in the world, maybe after Great Britain. According to your survey. Why are we seeing that gap between groups?
I think in a lot of ways, people are sort of, checking a box in life, and we see this, there's a habit we know from Elections Canada. They did a survey a few years ago where they found that if a young Canadian doesn't vote in the first 2 elections for which they're eligible to vote, the odds are over 80% that they will never vote their whole lives. And so I think
if they check out early, they're checked out.
Correct.
Yeah.
And also I think, unfortunately for a lot of our politics, some people just say, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative, and I'm done. I've checked that box. I'm going to sort of intellectually check out. I just know what my team is, and I'm going to do that. With young people, certainly with millennials, is that brand loyalty is less and less, and they're floating around and they're more open. So I think sort of that gap that exists in politics is in part due to people, frankly, being uninspired for a very long time about politics, being uninspired by the negativity of politics, and being disappointed by habitual, you hang around politics long enough, people tend to disappoint you. And that sort of serial disappointment of overhyped expectations and lack of delivering. I think people just sort of check a box, I'm with that team, if I'm inspired enough to vote, I will. And it's a bit of a wake-up call, I think, for those who are engaged in politics to do things a little differently.
There's some interesting, I think, underpinnings of this information, Joan, and a lot of it deals with whether people feel the system works for them. And we're seeing a lot of people who believe it doesn't. They feel there's injustice, they can't get ahead, they're worried about innovation, they're worried about trade deals, and that results in this polarization. And we've seen a lot of it in the United States. I think people would probably be naive, James, to think we wouldn't see it necessarily in this country if we don't know that it's coming and what to do about it. What's the tonic for that? What's the tonic for the polarization we're seeing now?
Well, I mean, I think looking back a little bit, it's probably the biggest reason that Donald Trump was elected president of the U.S., which was there were a bunch of people who felt like they'd been left behind, that their voices weren't being heard, and they looked at the two candidates and said, well, Hillary Clinton represents what's already happened. How bad can Donald Trump be? And they took a leap of faith. There are, if you look at the U.S., the Democratic field right now, you've got a variety of proposals, some that are very liberal, some that are more moderate, to really get at income inequality. That's really what's at the root of it, which is you've got, for instance, the granddaughter of Walt Disney, Abigail Disney, gave a speech last week saying that she was horrified that the CEO of the company was making 1,500 times more than someone working at Disney World. Right. And that's, so that's pervasive. And I think, you just need politicians that are going to do what, I'll harken back to my old boss, Bill Clinton, which was, if you don't have a strong middle class, the system won't work for people. And if you can't create educational opportunities, training opportunities, and the ability to pursue policies that lift all boats, you're not going to get there. The opportunity, in all of this, with all of this distrust, though, and the most interesting part of the survey, I think, is how people are looking at their own companies and CEOs and business, right. Which is they, by comparison, are trusted. So yeah. I think part of the answer here to your question is CEOs and the business communities have to step up. And, and I think they will, not because they want less profits, but I think you look at the millennial generation, you look at young people who want jobs, they're going to take a job for less money at a company that they think is doing something for right. the community and the values.
Right. One of the findings in this survey is that people want their companies. They want corporations to take the lead on social change, not wait for government to impose it, which I thought was really interesting.
Everybody wants to live a life of purpose, a life of value, that you look back on and it wasn't just, I accumulated these assets. You actually want to feel like you've done something of purpose. And that is now intrinsically tied with not only who you volunteer for, but also who you work for. And companies need to recognize that. It's enormously important.
Let's finish quickly on this. We spend a lot of time at this channel looking at the role of government and options facing policymakers. When you look at the survey findings that of the 4 institutions that people are surveyed in terms of their trust, government's last on the list. I think it's 53% in this country support. People think they have trust in the institution. What's the message there, James? Let me start with you for governments and policymakers.
My macro advice to those still in politics and the Canadian election is, one is make simple promises, keep simple promises, reinforce the value of government by following that rule. And the second is, politicians think that the elections are always about them. I'm guilty of that as well. And so Justin Trudeau will say, this election is about who do you want to be Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau or Andrew Scheer. No, voters think the election is about them, not about the politicians, and they're right. And politicians need to understand, you need to listen to the voters and understand that if they have anxiety about globalization, if they have anxiety about the economy, the issue is they get to decide the issue, and then you have to serve them the menu of solutions to the problems that they identify. It's not about you. There's no room in politics, in my view, for messianic leadership, megalomania. You have to actually represent voters' anxieties.
Right, Joel, you have a final comment to you on that.
Well, I agree with all of that, and I think if you look at the last 20 years, you can draw a sharp contrast between, Bill Clinton had his troubles, but he never focused or made himself a victim. He always understood you made it about the people. Donald Trump has done quite the opposite. I think for politicians, and I do have an American view, but I think the research does show that you see this in the UK as much as any place right now, that there's 2 things. One is compromise has to become a virtue again. I think in so many democracies we've become so polarized that compromise is seen as a weakness when compromise is actually a strength. The second is, even if it's to your advantage, you have to resist the urge to tear down institutions. You see that in the UK now with the Brexit fight. In the US, you see our president attacking the media, attacking the justice system, the FBI, attacking the Congress, attacking anything that seems to be in his way. So I think the politicians have to take a lead, and I think the silver lining in all of this is if you look at the 2018 elections in the U.S., Democrats won a big victory, and it wasn't because they lurched to the left.
Right.
It was because a bunch of moderate Democrats ran and they talked about health care and they talked about the economy, and they ignored what was going on in D.C., and they won an overwhelming victory. And that, I think, is a message that translates to Canada and beyond.
All right, Joel Lockhart, James Moore, thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.